Hello YouTube, this is Jeff. Welcome to CSS for Layout Part 4. In this episode we're going to use the float property to create columns. So first I've called up an example here that I've used previously. This is the example I used in the box model. And what I've done was made a very small change to it. I've created another div. So first I had my first paragraph here in a div called first, the second paragraph, which is the blue border, in a div called second, and then the new change that I made was I created a div around the whole thing called page. And in CSS I've written a style rule for my page ID. I've set the margin to auto so it will center on the page, the width to 1000, and the background color to this darker gray here, this mid-gray. If I preview it, you should be able to see what I've done. Here we go. Okay, so what I'd like to do is to make this into two columns using floats. What the float property does is it creates text wrap. So in old printing terms, text wrap means it usually refers to when you have text and an image together in a layout. Text wrap will allow the type to wrap around the borders of the image, so that it may be shorter when the image is here, but then wrap underneath the image or even on the other side of it. So text wrap on the web works pretty much the same way, except it's called the float property. And when we start using it to create columns, things can get a little tricky because it's not exactly a column property like it would be with tables. So let's try out some examples with float. First thing I'm going to do is something very simple. We're going to take our first column, we're going to float it left. So we want it to stick to the left hand side. Let's see what that looks like. There we go. Now we have text wrap. So the reason why the second column is still down here underneath it is because it is on the left hand side. That's where the origin point is. So it's just kind of down here underneath. If we wanted to push it over onto the right hand side, we could do the obvious thing, which is float it right. Let's try that. See how that looks. Aha. Okay, let's preview this in Firefox, and now we see what we expected. We have a column on the left and a column on the right, and you might be saying, hey, what happened to that gray background? Well, what happened was, because we floated both sections, basically there's no more content inside that div, and there's no more content to wrap around these two sections. So that area has completely collapsed. Essentially its height has been set to 0, so we can't see it on screen. Now that's useful because, remember, this is a text wrap. So if we had let's say a third column of information, you would want that to be able to kind of wrap in the middle here and go underneath it, possibly even start on top. So the div section for these two items is just simply the width is collapsed to 0. So this is often a problem for us. So we have a simple situation here. We want that gray background, and how can we get it back? So there's a couple of ways to do that. First one is kind of get rid of this float right. Okay, so that brings back our gray background, and of course it shifts the second over. If we want to move the second over to the right hand side, we could simply add a margin. So if we want to clear this first column, we could add the margin dash left property, and we could have, say, 400 pixels. Okay, let's see how that looks. There we go. So we've cleared it on the left by 400 pixels. So now we have two columns, although it still looks a little weird because now we've got some funky things happening with our top margin, and that's affecting the way these two things look. So another really effective way to repair that collapsing margin is to use another property called the clear property. So when you float something, that means it allows text to wrap around it. So if you have some section of text that you don't want to wrap around the picture, but you want to simply pass towards the bottom, we would call that clearing. So here's how we can make that work. I'm going to get rid of my margin left property and set my float right again. And so that's floating it, and our background disappears. And then I'm going to jump over here to our source code, and inside our page div I have my first and my second. So what I'm going to do is create a third. And this third doesn't have any content in it, just a div. I'm going to say style. I'm going to write it quick inline style equals, and we will set the clear property to clear both. So we can float left or right, so we can also clear left or right or both. Now what that does is this div, which is effectively invisible, forces the browser to render that gray background, because we're forcing that div to come all the way down here, even though it has no height, but to be pushed from the top of the screen to the bottom. And if we save all, we can preview that just to confirm it. And there we go. Okay, so there's some options there. Now I skipped over one of the simplest ways to create the two column layout here, and that is to simply reverse their order. So let me go back and we'll do one more thing here. I'm going to get rid of this, well actually I'll leave the float right, but I'm going to remove the float left for a second. Oops. Here we're using Internet Explorer now. Okay, so I removed the float left. So the first column does not have any text wrap around it, but the second column does. And the reason why the second column is not pushed up to the top is because, well, it can't. It's not being told to wrap around the first column. So what we can do to fix this is actually just change the location in HTML. So if I jump over to my source code here, I can actually take this second, which in this case is sort of the sidebar, and I will move it up here. So now I actually have the second column first. And maybe we shouldn't call them second or first, we should call them left and right. But changing them here I'd have to change my CSS. So let's just try this quickly. And there you have it. Now we have our two columns. So the first column is still here on the left, and the second column is here on the right. Again, we have like a margin issue here, but that's a pretty minor fix. So let's go to our big example here, which is our CSS page layout, where we have our page copy and our sidebar. And let's make this sidebar float right. So what I've done, you'll notice I've made some minor changes to my copy. I changed the colors. I made this dark red, which is the same dark red we used in our navigation bar, and I've also changed the font to white. I've changed the sidebar to like this gold or tan color, and the page copy, the main article here, I've changed the background color to white. Okay, so to push this sidebar over, the first thing I'm going to do is set up my widths. So if I go to my article, which is the page copy section, actually I'm just going to change this to article. That makes more sense. And I'm going to set the width to what I want it to be. So the sidebar will be 200 pixels. That means I need to subtract 200 from my overall page, from my article. So the overall page width is 1028. So if the sidebar is going to take up 200 of that, then I'm only going to be left with 828. Well, so then that's what my article needs to be. 828 px. Okay, there we go. We can see that it's shorter. So the sidebar now is going to be 200 pixels. There we go. Okay, we jump back here and preview it. There we go. Now you can see the space has been made for our sidebar to fit neatly over there. We just need to float the sidebar right. So what I'm going to do is actually move the sidebar so that it comes first on the page. Go. So I'm going to copy these lines, just move them up here. Okay. And save it. And then I'm going to jump over to my CSS. Actually, we'll preview this. And here we can see the sidebar now appears first in the flow. And we're going to take the sidebar and float it right. There we go. So we push over to the right. We can preview it in Firefox. And we'll see that. So we can preview this here. We can see that the sidebar has been pushed over to the right, but the footer has jumped up here. The reason why that's happening is because we basically, when we set the sidebar to float right, we've said, hey, if there's any text that follows the sidebar, it can simply wrap around it in the available space. So it's coming up here on the left. That includes our footer. Now if we don't want our footer to be pushed up here, then we need to use the clear property. We simply find our footer div and set it to clear the sidebar. Here's our footer. We say clear, and both is really commonly used. You could just clear one or the other, but we'll just clear both here. And where did our footer go? Down at the bottom. So let's just preview that again in Firefox. We can, and there we go. Now one problem we have is like, well, we've got this big empty space here. So how can we fill that with that white, or make the white come all the way down? There's a pretty simple solution for that. This whole page is wrapped in its own div called the page div, which is right here. So if I add the background color here and I set the color to white, it's essentially going to make that whole section white. And where the nav bar and things like that are, they're overriding that color. So that those are not white. But you can see that the article page does extend all the way down now, even though that div ends right at the end of that paragraph. Now, we're just going to clean this up a little bit. We can see that in our heading, our article, our sidebar, and our footer, the copy goes right to the edge of our divs, which doesn't really look nice. Usually when you do this, you're going to have some spacing in between, or some channels in between the edges of your sections and your copy. And that's called padding. So if I jump over to our CSS, I can just find our sections. We have the page section here, which is actually the overall piece. I don't want to change that. We have our heading, and our heading does have some padding in there, but I'm just going to change this to padding all around 10 pixels. And it didn't change the bottom, but it did add some on the left. and on the top. And then in our sidebar, we will add the padding 10 pixels. And in the article, we will add padding 10 pixels. And the final one is in the footer. We'll add padding. There we go. Now if I preview this, we should see the change. There we go. So now we have some space in between the edge of our color scheme and the type. Looks a lot neater, a lot cleaner on the eye. Okay, now a couple more properties I've added. I see I've got them commented out here. One is the box shadow, which is a new property in CSS3. And the way this works is it essentially creates a gray or a blurry shadow, a drop shadow effect. So I've got my page div, which is the overall layout, and the first two values are the offset, which is X and Y, so I'm not offsetting this. The second two values are the blur and spread, which if you're familiar with drop shadow in Photoshop, you know, create kind of a blurry shadow effect that's a little bit larger than the object that you're shadowing. And then this color scheme is the color that's going to be used for my drop shadow. Save this and preview, and this should create a drop shadow effect on the sides here, which looks nice. And the last one, I'm going to set up a border radius on my sidebar. So if I find my sidebar here, I have the border radius property. So this makes rounded edges on your rectangles. So the border dash radius property. If you just type in one number, one value, then it's going to round all four sides. But I've given it 4 values. So I'm saying top left, bottom right, and then the top left, bottom left, top right, and bottom right set to 0. So now we have a rounded edge here, and at the bottom we have a rounded edge there. Oh, there you go. That's page layout in CSS.